when I was reading Jonathan's article, I was a little taken aback, to be honest with you. Let me read a little bit, some of it here for you, so you can get a sense. He says, proponents of the presuppositional school of apologetics typically stress the vitality of reckoning with the noetic effects of sin, that is, the effect of the fall upon the mind, from the Greek word for mind, nous. Van Tillians argue that sin has corrupted man's ability to properly comprehend the things of God and understand spiritual things. Well, that's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians and Romans. In particular, sin is understood to have impacted our ability to reason and think rationally, especially in relation to God. Well, if you're constantly suppressing the knowledge of God, that's correct. Of the apologetic systems, the noetic effect of sin is emphasized only by presuppositionalists. Now, I would question that. I have thankfully talked with evidentialists, classicalists. There's a lot of people that don't really make much of a distinction between the two. But I've talked to a number of people that do recognize the noetic effect of sin and do recognize that apart from the reparative work of the Spirit, maybe in some type of prevenient grace type idea, but still some supernatural impact of the work of the Spirit of God, you're not gonna get past that fundamental rebellion that the sinner is in. Cornelius Van Til gives the following analogy to illustrate what he means by the noetic effects of sin. Now, what's interesting here is he quotes from Van Til. I'm going to read you Van Til's example. It's one of the ones that's well known. If you've read Van Til, you've already read this one. But I want you to hear what Van Til said, and then notice how Jonathan McClatchy interprets it, because he misinterprets what Van Til says. And it seems extremely common, and it goes back to your theology. Theology determines apologetics. And it goes back to what you believe about man. So listen to what Van Til said. The intellect of fallen man may be compared to a buzzsaw that is sharp and shining, ready to cut the boards that come to it. Let us say that a carpenter wishes to cut 50 boards for the purpose of laying the floor of a house. He has marked his boards. He has set his saw. He begins at one end of the mark on the board, but he does not know that his 7-year-old son has tampered with the saw and changed its set. The result is that every board he saws is cut slantwise and thus unusable because too short except at the point where the saw first made its contact with the wood. As long as the set of the saw is not changed, the result will always be the same. So also, whenever the teachings of Christianity are presented to the natural man, they will be cut according to the set of the sinful human personality. Okay, so Van Til is saying is that in that set of the saw, if you don't have that set to where it's going to cut straight, it's going to consistently miss the mark. It's going to produce something that's going to be twisted and warped and basically unusual. And it's going to do so consistently over time. That's his analogy. That's what he's saying. And that's Paul's point in Romans chapter 1. The rebellion of man in sin impacts all of human thought. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. Their foolish hearts were darkened. That darkening of the heart is the very inner aspect of man. There's nothing more personal than that. So, notice what Jonathan says. He says, I would argue, however, that while the imago Dei is effaced by human sin, it is not erased. Stop. Van Til never said it was. We don't believe it was. I know Geisler said we said that, and I've heard lots of... It is a common myth. It's a common myth. We do not teach that the image of God has been erased. And Van Til didn't say anything about erasure of the image of God. He's talking about the set of the saw is the function that presuppositions have in the determination of a worldview. And so if you have a person who is suppressing the knowledge of God, and there are many ways of doing that. The atheists can do it. The religious person can do it. You can have religious suppression. You can have non-religious suppression. You can have plain old addiction. Utilization of drugs and alcohol is a form of the suppression of the knowledge of God. There are lots of different ways of doing it. That does not mean that the Imago Dei has been erased. But these presuppositions change the set of the saw so that when the revelation of God's truth comes to the rebel sinner, it is twisted and altered so that that truth is deflected from revealing the key issue, and that is, you are the creature of God and you are in rebellion against God. You don't have any right to be sitting up there on that throne. That's God's throne. You don't have any right to be up there. You cannot put God in the dock and judge God. You are his creature. He made you. He has perfect right over you. And whatever you've got to do to the set of the saw to keep it from cutting into that, that's what you do. You can do it religiously. You can do it secularly. You can do it in all sorts of different ways. So, no one is saying that the Imago Dei is erased. Okay? He says, I do not believe that sin renders us totally incapable of rational thought. Well, how do you define rational? If we are made to think God's thoughts, if we are made to honor and glorify him in all things, then the most perfect rational thought will be that thought that is in complete harmony with and submission to the lordship of God in all things. That will be the most rational thought. So if I am suppressing the knowledge of God, then there are many unbelievers who can teach symbolic logic, but they cannot account for why what they teach one semester is the same as what they teach another semester. So they cannot account for the origin of the consistency of those laws of thought. But they can teach the laws of thought. And I have met, I remember when I wrote the little book, What's with the Mutant and the Microscope. I really wish those had been kept in print. What's with the Mutant and the Microscope for junior high schoolers, but a lot of adults found it to be extremely useful. Anyways, one of the things I point out is back when, as I said earlier in the program, I was Department Fellow in Anatomy and Physiology. I was at a Christian college, but we did not use Christian textbooks. So we had secular scientific textbooks written by unbelievers promoting evolutionary theory, naturalistic worldview, so on and so forth. Yet in those very textbooks, the authors, because they're made in the image of God, could not avoid but use language when you see the complexity of life and its plain and obvious design. They would let the mask slip. This was back before everybody had to wear them all the time. They would let the mask, the other mask, the mask of hiding, they'd let the mask slip, and they would say things. They would actually use terms like beautiful of the interactive complexity of biological systems. Well, and then they might, a few sentences later, try to sort of admit they shouldn't have talked about design and things like that, but they can't help themselves. They cannot help themselves. And so what is meant by rational thought? If you think what we're saying is, unless you're a Christian, you can't do calculus or geometry or trigonometry. I was never really big into the mathematics, but the thing I loved the most was when we did geometric proofs and stuff like that. I thought that was awesome. That was sophomore year in high school, and I thought it was great. There were other guys in the class that weren't believers that could do the exact same thing I could. So we're not saying that. What we are saying is that as long as you are, and this is theology determines apologetics. The Christian faith says every person is the creature of God, the creation of God. And therefore, if you live in such a way as to consistently suppress that reality, you are not going to be perfectly rational. It's the consistency issue that comes up here. What you're doing up here isn't going to connect down here with the foundation. That's where the issue is. Okay? He says, to the contrary, as the late classical apologist R.C. Sproul points out, and I would highly recommend listening to the conversation between Bahnsen and Sproul on these issues, the best pagan thinkers can still spot errors of logic without being born again. You don't have to be regenerate in order to get a PhD in mathematics. Yes, that's what R.C. said, but R.C. would have totally disagreed with everything that came before this from Jonathan McClatchy. I can guarantee you that. I can guarantee you that. He would not have agreed that what even the presuppositionalist is saying is that the Imago Dei has been erased, and he would agree with what I just said in regards to the suppression of the knowledge of God. He would. Just did not. I'm not sitting here going, because I knew RC, we had dinner together. I'm not saying that. I'm saying because I've listened to his dialogue with Greg Bahnsen, listened to it twice recently to refresh my mind on it. And it was recorded years and years ago. Very, very clear. Very, very clear. Indeed, the suppression described in Romans 1, 18-20 is, I would suggest, a voluntary one, though one lapsed into easily enough due perhaps to ordinary cognitive biases. That is why Paul can describe the unbeliever as being without excuse. He could do better if he tried, but he does not. Thus, in the relevant sense in which presuppositionalists have in mind, I am not convinced that there is such a thing as the noetic effects of sin. Wow. Okay. That's a huge gap. That is a chasm. And that is a chasm that only a few have been willing to stand on that other side down through the history of the church with quite that boldness. Even those who affirmed a concept of freedom of the will wanted to recognize biblical teaching on this subject, and that's where prevenient grace came from and stuff like that. Just to simply boldly say there is no sin does not affect the mind of man really leaves you in a difficult spot. So how can one come to that type of a conclusion in light of not only the passages that say to speak of man's inability? No one can come to me unless the Father sent me draws him. Couldn't you come up with, couldn't you observe the ministry of Jesus and come to the conclusion that you should follow him just simply from a unbiased examination of the facts? It seems to be what's being said. Jesus' teaching is no. You will only hear his words when you belong to God, not by you choosing to belong to God, by God choosing you to belong to him. Then you can hear his words and follow after him. That's the order of John 6, John 8, John 10. So you have those clear passages of scripture along those lines.